Forget the glossy blockbusters you already know. The 1960s wasn't just about apes on beaches or trippy space voyages. Hidden underneath the polished studio hits were scrappy, bizarre, and sometimes genius American sci-fi films that almost nobody talks about anymore. Some were too bleak, others too weird, and a few just fell through the cracks of history. But they're all worth revisiting. So, how many of these forgotten gems have slipped past you? Let's find out. 1. The Power 1968. Here's a film that feels like it should have been huge, but instead got buried. The Power isn't just another Cold War thriller. It's a paranoia-driven mindbender about a scientist who discovers that one of his research colleagues has telepathic abilities, and he's willing to kill to protect his secret. Imagine the Manchurian Candidate, but with brain-melting psychic duels instead of political manipulation. The movie opens like a typical lab-bound mystery, but soon reality itself starts shifting. People die in bizarre accidents, minds get twisted, and the entire story blurs into a surreal battle between human intellect and unstoppable psychic force. George Pal, the legendary producer behind The Time Machine, brought his flair for spectacle here. But instead of grand visuals, he leaned into paranoia, filling the screen with warped imagery and unsettling close-ups that made viewers feel like the world was collapsing in on itself. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Too cerebral for drive-in crowds, too pulpy for the art house. It sat in limbo, dismissed as a minor oddity. But watching it now, you realize it was pointing toward the sci-fi paranoia that would dominate the 70s. It's messy, sure, but it's also wildly ambitious. Think of it as the thinking person's forgotten psychic thriller, a cult classic waiting to be rediscovered. The Angry Red Planet, 1960. Ever wondered what happens when a low-budget studio decides to make Mars look like a fever dream? You get The Angry Red Planet. This movie might be clunky as a rocket built in a garage, but visually, it's unforgettable. Instead of shooting on elaborate sets, the filmmakers used something called cinemagic, a cheap optical process that bathed Mars in a blood-red haze and turned the landscape into something that looked more like a nightmare painting than a real planet. The story? A crew lands on Mars, wanders around, and gets attacked by oversized creatures, including the now infamous rat-bat-spider-crab hybrid. Yes, you heard that right. The monster looks like a doodle from a middle school notebook come to life. And yet, that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not polished, but it sticks in your brain. Audiences in 1960 didn't know what to think. Some laughed, some cringed, and most critics brushed it off as junk. But over time, the sheer weirdness of its visuals gave it cult status. While other sci-fi movies from the decade faded into obscurity, The Angry Red Planet became the film you remember even if you only saw it once. It's not about realism, it's about raw imagination slapped together on a shoestring budget. And honestly, that's the spirit of 60s sci-fi in a nutshell, wild ideas that sometimes outran their budgets but never ran out of nerve. 3. The Time Travelers, 1964. This one feels like the grandparent of every portal accident movie that came later. The Time Travelers is about a group of scientists who accidentally open a window into the future, and of course, everything goes wrong. Instead of the shining utopias of 50s sci-fi, they find a scorched wasteland run by androids and the last remnants of humanity trying to survive underground. What makes it work isn't just the concept, but the execution. The film has a surprisingly grim atmosphere for its time. The future isn't hopeful or shiny, it's claustrophobic, dusty, and terrifying. The scientists aren't heroes so much as terrified witnesses, stumbling into a nightmare they can't control. By the end, the movie pulls a chilling twist that still lands today, looping the story back on itself in a way that feels almost Twilight Zone-worthy. On release, it barely made a ripple. Audiences expecting ray guns and flashy aliens got a bleak story about human extinction and machines replacing us. Sound familiar? Yeah, decades before The Terminator, this little 60s film was already warning about it. It doesn't get the credit it deserves, partly because it looks dated now, but the ideas inside it are razor sharp. It's one of those films that proves 60s sci-fi wasn't just cheesy robots, it could be haunting, thoughtful, and eerily ahead of its time. 4. Panic in Year Zero. 1962. When people talk about Cold War sci-fi, they usually jump to Dr. Strangelove or Failsafe. But Panic in Year Zero plays like their scrappier, more terrifying cousin. Directed by and starring Ray Milland, this is less about mushroom clouds in the distance and more about what happens to ordinary people when society collapses. The setup is brutal. A family leaves Los Angeles for a camping trip just as nuclear bombs hit the city. Cut off from the world, they have to fight for food, fend off desperate survivors, and figure out how far they're willing to go to stay alive. It's sci-fi stripped of lasers and spaceships, replaced by roadside shootouts and moral compromises. What makes it hit hard is its honesty. The movie doesn't sugarcoat survival. Milland's character is forced to make ugly choices, including stealing supplies and arming his family against other survivors. It was shocking for its time. Audiences in the early 60s weren't used to seeing good guys behave this ruthlessly. The movie wasn't a massive success, and critics dismissed it as grim exploitation. But watching it now, it feels disturbingly relevant. It predicted the gritty survivalism that would dominate post-apocalyptic films for decades. You could draw a straight line from Panic in Year Zero to The Walking Dead. It's not flashy, but it's raw, unsettling, and way more realistic than most of its big-budget cousins. 5. The Last Woman on Earth, 1960. Leave it to Roger Corman to take a bare-bones budget and turn it into something haunting. The Last Woman on Earth starts as a tropical vacation movie and turns into an end-of-the-world parable. 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, go diving in Puerto Rico, and when they resurface, everyone else is gone. No explanation, no disaster montage. Just emptiness. At first, it's all about survival, finding food, figuring out if anyone else is alive. But quickly, it becomes about something darker, the breakdown of human relationships when society isn't there to keep order. The 2 men begin fighting for dominance, with the woman caught in the middle of their clash. Suddenly, the end of the world feels less like radiation or aliens and more like an ugly mirror of human nature. The movie was shot fast and cheap, like most Corman productions, but that actually works in its favor. The empty streets of San Juan feel eerie because they really were deserted, captured guerrilla style on film. There's no big destruction sequence, but the quiet emptiness makes it feel scarier than stock footage ever could. Critics shrugged it off, calling it slight, but in hindsight, it's chillingly effective. It turns the apocalypse into something personal and painfully intimate. Instead of asking, "What if the world ends?" it asks, "What kind of person will you be when it does?" And that question never really goes out of style. 6. X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, 1963. Roger Corman had a knack for turning pulp ideas into unforgettable nightmares, and X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, might be his sharpest swing. Ray Milland plays Dr. Xavier, a scientist who develops drops that give him X-ray vision. At first, it's intoxicating. He can see through walls, cheat at cards, and peel back the fabric of reality itself. But the longer he uses it, the more horrifying it becomes. The film starts playful, almost comic book in tone, but slowly it mutates into cosmic horror. Xavier can't turn it off. He starts seeing things he shouldn't, things beyond the edges of the universe. Everyday life becomes unbearable because he can literally see too much. Milland, usually cast as refined gentleman, unravels on screen, sweating, panicked, eyes wide with existential terror. Corman made it cheap, but the ideas are anything but. The film is a warning about obsession, unchecked science, and the curse of knowledge itself. It straddles that line between pulp schlock and Lovecraftian dread, where curiosity doesn't just kill the cat, it damns the soul. At the time, audiences weren't ready for something so bleak. They wanted monsters, ray guns, or at least a happy ending. Instead, they got a story that spiraled into madness. Critics dismissed it as another drive-in gimmick, but modern reappraisals see it as a masterpiece of low-budget science fiction. It's one of those movies that crawls under your skin because the concept is so simple, yet so terrifying. Imagine never being able to close your eyes to reality. Imagine seeing too much and realizing some doors were never meant to be opened. That's the power and the curse of X7, the creation of the Humanoids, 1962. If you only judged by its title, you'd expect the creation of the Humanoids to be a silly robot flick with tinfoil costumes and zap guns. But this movie is so much stranger and smarter than it looks. Filmed on a shoestring budget with barely any action, it plays out more like a philosophical play than a standard sci-fi adventure. Set in a bleak post-nuclear world, humans are dying off, and androids known as humanoids are gradually taking their place. The catch? They're becoming more human than the humans left alive. Most of the film is dialogue, intense debates about what it means to be alive, to have a soul, or even to love. In the middle of this, a radical human group tries to stop the humanoids from replacing them, leading to a twist ending that flips everything upside down. Here's the wild part. Andy Warhol reportedly loved this movie. That alone tells you it's not your standard B picture. Critics at the time dismissed it as too talky, too stiff. But decades later, people realized it was grappling with questions that Blade Runner would explore in the 80s. Yes, the sets look like leftovers from a high school auditorium. Yes, the actors sometimes feel wooden. But the ideas? They're decades ahead of their time. Instead of zapping aliens, it asked, if machines think, feel, and love, what makes them any less human than us? It's the kind of film you'd stumble across late at night and end up glued to, not because of explosions or monsters, but because of the uneasy feeling it leaves you with. A forgotten relic that proves 60s sci-fi was sometimes smarter than anyone gave it credit for. 8. The Navy versus the Night Monsters, 1966. This is one of those movies where the title tells you exactly what you're in for, and yet it still manages to be weirder than you'd expect. The Navy versus the Night Monsters takes place on a remote Antarctic base where Marines face off against deadly, acidic plant creatures that come alive at night. Sounds goofy? It absolutely is, but that's part of its charm. The production history is just as messy as the movie. Originally intended to be a straight-up horror film, it was chopped and rewritten until it became more of a monster flick. You can practically feel the behind-the-scenes chaos in the final product. 1 minute, it's deadly serious. The next, it's pure B-movie mayhem. And then there's Mamie Van Doren, the glamour star brought in to add sex appeal, except she spends most of the movie screaming and running from killer shrubs. Critics roasted it at the time, dismissing it as drive-in trash. And to be fair, the effects are laughable. The monsters look like something dragged out of a Halloween store, but if you tune into its campy energy, it's surprisingly fun. The isolated setting, the constant paranoia about who'll get attacked next, and the sheer audacity of killer plants versus the Navy make it unforgettable. It's not high art. It's not even particularly good by conventional standards. But it's a perfect example of that fearless 60s sci-fi spirit, throwing wild ideas on screen and hoping they stick. And honestly, sometimes the more ridiculous it is, the more fun you have. 9th, Journey to the Seventh Planet. 1962, sometimes sci-fi in the 60s felt less like movies and more like fever dreams. Journey to the Seventh Planet is one of those. Produced for American International Pictures, it follows astronauts on a mission to Uranus, only to discover the planet is controlled by a bizarre alien intelligence that can read their thoughts and create illusions. The setup is simple, but the execution is hypnotic. The astronauts wander through landscapes that shift from alien deserts to Earth-like meadows, to surreal visions pulled straight from their minds. At first, it feels like a cheap knockoff of Forbidden Planet, but then it leans into its hallucinatory style, blurring the line between reality and imagination. The effects are crude, the acting stiff, but the film radiates strangeness. There's an eerie sense that nothing the crew sees is real, and by extension, nothing you're seeing as a viewer is real either. It plays more like a dream you can't quite wake up from than a straightforward sci-fi adventure. On release, it didn't impress anyone. Critics brushed it aside, and audiences mostly forgot it. But viewed today, it has this strange, haunting quality that sticks with you. It's less about plot and more about mood, an early example of psychedelic sci-fi before the late 60s boom. It's easy to dismiss as another low-budget oddity, but if you watch it with the right mindset, it's surprisingly ahead of its time. It's trippy, unsettling, and strangely beautiful in its own clunky way. A forgotten gem for fans who like their sci-fi weird, not just loud. 10. The Daymars Invaded Earth, 1963. Forget giant monsters and ray guns, this one is all about quiet dread. The Daymars Invaded Earth doesn't have a single bug-eyed alien running around. Instead, it tells the story of a scientist who returns home from a Mars probe mission, only to realize something is off. One by one, his family members are replaced by eerie doubles. What makes it so effective is its restraint. The replacements aren't flashy. They're just off. The family looks the same, talks the same, but acts with a strange, unsettling detachment. It's less about jump scares and more about that slow, creeping realization that the people closest to you might not be who they seem. The movie builds atmosphere with empty suburban streets, long shadows, and a constant sense of unease. It's not about action, it's about paranoia. At a time when most American sci-fi was still leaning into atomic monsters, this went smaller and scarier, closer to Invasion of the Body Snatchers than The Blob. It never got the love it deserved. Critics dismissed it as too slow, too uneventful. But for fans of eerie, low-key sci-fi, it's a forgotten treasure. Watching it now, it feels like an American cousin to British classics like Quatermass, more psychological than sensational. It proves you don't need $1 million budget to creep people out. Sometimes all it takes is a familiar face acting just a little too strange. 11. The Human Duplicators, 1965. If you want a movie that screams drive-in paranoia, The Human Duplicators delivers. The plot is pulp perfection. Aliens come to Earth, start replacing people with robotic duplicates, and slowly infiltrate society. On paper, it's nothing new, but the execution is pure 60s cheese, the kind of camp that's impossible not to enjoy. George Nader plays the FBI agent trying to stop the invasion, while Richard Kiel, yes, the guy who later became famous as Jaws in the Bond movies, plays the towering alien henchman. Every scene he's in feels like a comic book panel brought to life. The robots themselves? Clunky, stiff, and unintentionally hilarious, but somehow that adds to the film's offbeat charm. The special effects are laughably bad. 1 minute you're watching a stiff duplicate being activated with glowing lights. The next, you're looking at obvious mannequins. But the weirdness is exactly what makes it memorable. The movie doesn't pretend to be anything more than what it is. A pulpy invasion story with just enough atmosphere to keep you hooked. Audiences at the time brushed it aside as filler, another cheap knockoff riding the coattails of Body Snatchers. But over time, it built a reputation among cult film fans. Watching it now feels like stepping into a time capsule where fear of infiltration and mistrust of authority bled into low-budget sci-fi thrillers. Is it good? Not by traditional standards, but is it fun, wild, and a snapshot of atomic-era paranoia? Absolutely. And sometimes that's all you need. 12. The Atomic Submarine 1960. You wouldn't think a black-and-white submarine movie could be tense, but the Atomic Submarine pulls it off. This one takes the Cold War paranoia underwater, as a nuclear-powered sub is dispatched to investigate mysterious ship disappearances under the Arctic. What they find isn't a Soviet threat, but something stranger, an alien craft lurking beneath the ice. The brilliance of this movie is how it blends two anxieties of the era, nuclear war and the unknown lurking just beyond human reach. Most of the film plays out as a claustrophobic submarine thriller, packed with sweaty close-ups of officers clashing over what to do. Then, in the final act, it explodes into full-on sci-fi as the crew confronts a bizarre, one-eyed alien intelligence. It's part war movie, part monster movie, and part cosmic horror, all wrapped into a tight 70 minutes. Sure, the effects look cheap now. The alien feels like a rubber puppet, and the battles are clunky. But the mood is so strong, you barely care. It captures the sense of dread that was in the air in 1960. The idea that technology could either save us or lead us right into something we couldn't fight. Critics ignored it, and it never had the cult success of bigger titles. But it's a fascinating relic that shows how American sci-fi could be bold even on a tiny budget. If you love your thrillers with a dose of alien terror, this is a forgotten gem. 13. The Wizard of Mars, 1965. Now, this one is flat-out bizarre. The Wizard of Mars is basically The Wizard of Oz reimagined on the Red Planet, with John Carradine as a cryptic Martian wizard guiding lost astronauts. Yes, it's as strange as it sounds. A crew crash lands on Mars and discovers a desolate, eerie landscape filled with surreal imagery. They encounter bizarre visions, crumbling ruins, and illusions meant to test them. And just like Dorothy's crew, they're seeking a way home, but instead of a yellow brick road, they wander through endless deserts and empty Martian cities. The sets are minimal, the acting uneven, and the budget practically non-existent. Yet the atmosphere is weirdly hypnotic. The barren landscapes, combined with Carradine's strange monologues, make it feel less like a conventional sci-fi film and more like an experimental art project disguised as a B-movie. At the time, nobody knew what to make of it. Too artsy for drive-in crowds, too cheap-looking for critics. It slipped into obscurity. But now it's fascinating as a piece of psychedelic sci-fi before psychedelic sci-fi was even a trend. It's trippy, unsettling, and unlike anything else from its era. It's not polished, and it certainly won't be for everyone. But if you're into offbeat, dreamlike sci-fi that feels more like wandering through someone's subconscious than watching a movie, The Wizard of Mars deserves a spot on your list. 14. Wild in the Streets, 1968. This isn't just sci-fi, it's counterculture cinema with a dystopian twist. Wild in the Streets takes the rebellious energy of the 60s and cranks it into nightmare territory. The premise: a rock star rises to political power, lowers the voting age to 14, and eventually turns America into a youth dictatorship where anyone over 30 is considered useless. On the surface, it's campy satire with psychedelic visuals and a heavy rock soundtrack. But dig deeper, and it's a sharp critique of both youth rebellion and establishment fear. The "Don't trust anyone over 30" slogan becomes literal policy, and soon older generations are forced into camps while teenagers run the country. It's outrageous, exaggerated, and deliberately shocking. Audiences in 1968 didn't know how to handle it. Some saw it as a joke, others as a terrifying prediction. Critics either dismissed it as sensational trash or praised it as biting social commentary. Either way, it caused a stir. Watching it today, it feels like a time capsule of late 60s anxieties. What happens when counterculture runs wild, unchecked? It's messy, over the top, and sometimes ridiculous, but that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. If you want a film that captures the chaotic spirit of the decade while still delivering dystopian sci-fi vibes, Wild in the Streets is it. 15. Latitude 0, 1969. If you think 60s sci-fi always played it safe, Latitude 0 is proof that sometimes filmmakers went completely off the rails. This movie, a co-production between American International Pictures and Japan's Toho Studios, feels like 20,000 leagues under the sea collided with a Saturday morning cartoon, and the result is gloriously bizarre. The setup: scientists stumble into an undersea utopia called Latitude 0, run by a mysterious, ageless American named Captain Mackenzie. His submarine, the Alpha, isn't just a ship, It's practically a futuristic fortress loaded with gadgets that put James Bond's Q to shame. The crew explores a hidden world beneath the ocean, facing off against villains with mutant creatures, armored soldiers, and one of the strangest monster battles you'll ever see. Here's the kicker. The cast includes Joseph Cotten, an Oscar-winning actor looking completely at home piloting a submarine while spouting pulpy dialogue about science and destiny. Alongside him is Cesar Romero, yes, the Joker from the Batman TV show, chewing scenery as the villain. It's surreal watching these respected Hollywood faces hurling themselves into what feels like a comic book fever dream. At the time, American critics barely touched it. It was seen as too campy, too foreign, too odd to take seriously. But fans who found it later discovered a film overflowing with imagination. The sets are lavish, the costumes colorful, and the sheer creativity of its underwater world puts bigger budget productions to shame. Latitude Zero isn't polished, but it's fearless. It dares to be outrageous, blending pulp adventure, superhero energy, and Cold War sci-fi into something unforgettable. It's the kind of movie you watch once and immediately wonder how on earth it isn't better known. So there you have it, 15 underrated sci-fi oddities from the 1960s that proved the decade wasn't just about astronauts and apes. These were the films that pushed boundaries, stumbled into brilliance, or just went completely off the rails in the best way possible. Which of these have you seen, and which are you adding to your watch list? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's strangest corners.